And it looks like we're live. Hello and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're going to be talking about music as we typically do, which a wise man once said was a bit like dancing about architecture. But I think we're going to do a bit of both without dancing around any of the subject matter because the relationship between music and architecture actually is a very fascinating one. It's very symbiotic in some ways, and it's interesting to see how, at some times in history, the architecture influences the music, and at other times, music influences the architecture, and how both are very important when it comes to the commercial considerations of the modern music industry. Now, acoustics and volume in terms of how many people can have music exposed to them at once from an auditory perspective has always been an issue so long as music was around. And this is why, for example, in ancient Greece, the amphitheater at Epidaurus was known and remains known among acousticians around the world as one of the best places on earth in history to hear music. In many ways, the entire tale of modern Western technology, it's really about catching up with what the ancient Greeks were doing. This is true in both scientific and, frankly, sociological matters in many ways. But our story really begins in the age where music becomes commercialized. And this is in the 19th century. And the reason that the commercialization of music had a lot of long lasting impacts on both the world of architecture and the world of composition and performance is no coincidence. When a lot of people want to hear the same thing at once, prior to the advent of recorded sound, of course, you needed to have them in one place. And the 19th century was, of course, the era when music leaves, or it doesn't leave, but in addition to remaining in the aristocratic homes and the churches, it is now coming into locations that are commercial spaces purely designed for audiences to listen to music. The modern concert hall being the most important of these inventions, as was the opera house. The reason I say that the concert hall is more important is that opera already existed as a popular art form, but the concert hall, where people would go to hear a large modern symphony orchestra, was rather new in the 19th century. When you look at some of the early attempts in the 18th century to create public spaces to hear live music on a commercial basis rather than that of the basis of patronage, a large aristocratic home, or in a church, we see that many of these early venues are rather small. And the reason for this is that music itself was much of a smaller event, if you will, than it became in the 19th century. One of the earliest examples of this was opened in 1763 in Edinburgh, and this is St. Cecilia's Hall. Now, it's no coincidence that this happened in Scotland, because Scotland was generally ahead of a lot of other European countries when it came to the commercialization of music. And this has a lot to do with the background of Scotland as a Presbyterian nation. This is why, for instance, while the great universities in England and in France were focused mainly on theological issues and the philosophical studies which stemmed from theology, the Presbyterianism of Scotland was very much tolerant and even encouraging of scientific inquiry, which is why so many of the great inventions that powered the first and second industrial revolutions came out of Scotland. And on the same token, this is why we see a place for music outside of the big aristocratic house and outside of the church having a place in Scotland. Commercialized music, the concert hall. But St. Cecilia's in Edinburgh looks very different than the kind of grand, huge even concert halls that we saw taking shape in the 19th century. So, what happened in the 19th century? Well, the first chicken that gave birth to the first egg was Beethoven, because Beethoven demanded large orchestras, certainly if you're going to play it correctly. And this was absolutely unambiguous by the time you get to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. By that time, the great minds of classical music performance realized that it was high time for bigger orchestras to play in bigger venues that had better acoustics, and that as a result, more people could hear that music. And the person who had more influence than anyone else in seeing that dream of Beethoven come to life was a man whose name is probably relatively familiar to those who watch this channel, and that is Richard Wagner. Wagner made the orchestra big. He posthumously gave Beethoven the large orchestra that his music and that he personally deserved in his lifetime. And once that happened, once the Wagnerian Revolution in increasing the size and the professionalism and the discipline and the commercial appeal of the large orchestra, once that happened, there was no going back. And so from the middle of the 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, we see these new larger than life concert halls and opera houses spring to life. Wagner himself is responsible for the world's first ultra modern opera house in Bayreuth. Not only was it modern in terms of its size and acoustics, but it was modern in terms of the fact that it was democratic. Absent were the box seats that separated the grand from the ordinary people, the wealthy from the poor. There was a bowl shape where the inference was that the sightlines and the access to the best acoustics should be much more democratically spread than elsewhere. And we see in the 19th century and into the 20th century so many great concert halls built. In Vienna, for example, we have the Musikverein, a wonderful concert hall purpose built for the Vienna Philharmonic. We see the Vienna State Opera, a modern opera house, not quite as modern as Bayreuth, but in the same place. We also see in this century the first Philharmonie in Berlin. Well, not purpose built, it was purpose renovated, so much so that I would say the original Philharmonie in Berlin was absolutely one of these first generations of these grand 19th century concert halls. Sadly, it was lost in the Second World War. In Amsterdam, we see at the end of the 19th century, in the 1880s, the Concertgebouw, world renowned to this very day for its modern sounding acoustics, very ahead of its time as a concert hall, part of this grand tradition. We saw in London the great Queen's Hall, also renowned for its acoustics. Sadly, much like the original Philharmonie in Berlin, it was destroyed in the war. And we see the second great Gewandhaus in Leipzig, built in the 1880s, a wonderful place which also sadly no longer exists. North America, of course, was becoming very wealthy, the United States in particular, by the end of the 19th century. And the increasing love of European classical music among the still mostly European United States meant that large concert halls were being built there as well. For the New York Philharmonic, there was the great Carnegie Hall. There was the original Metropolitan Opera House as well. In Philadelphia, for the great Philadelphia Orchestra, the finest, in my opinion, the finest American orchestra in the first 50 years of the 20th century, and arguably beyond, you have the beautiful Academy of Music, which, like Carnegie Hall, is still there. If you're in Philadelphia doing something other than recounting ballads, I really suggest that you take a look at it. Even if there's no show on, try to get a tour or try to see it, because it's really a beautiful place. Chicago, a very toddling town, their 19th century symphony center was and is absolutely gorgeous. It was actually built in 1904, the very beginning of the 20th century. But like I said, this trend in these larger than life concert halls was something that began in the 1850s and went on until the middle of the 20th century. Cleveland, Ohio, with the great Cleveland Orchestra. Severance Hall opened in 1931, still considered one of the most beautiful of all concert halls. At the very beginning of the 20th century, Boston Symphony Hall with the great Boston Symphony, absolutely wonderful. So we see on both sides of the Atlantic big orchestras pioneered by Beethoven, but really created in the way we would understand it now by Wagner and his contemporaries. That was something that spurred on this wonderful growth in these concert halls. And when you look at the first small, humble concert hall in Edinburgh from the 18th century and compare it to these huge, ornate, architecturally sophisticated, and gorgeous concert halls of the 19th and early 20th centuries, you can see how the size of music growing spurred on a revolution in architecture. More people wanted to hear the loud, dynamic music. This necessitated concert halls worthy of the name. And this was highly important. Now, music went from getting big because of the size of the orchestra, the number of people, the number of instruments on stage, to then getting bigger because of the advent of recording, radio, and amplification. And this had the most immediate effect on vocalists because it meant that vocalists were no longer having to rely on the acoustician, which wasn't even a formal profession. I mean, there were always people concerned with acoustics, but it was really the architects who were responsible for it. A standalone acoustician that would come in to see how they could work with the architect was really a second half of the 20th century phenomenon in many ways. But now you had vocalists who were able to rely on the microphone beginning in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is an example of the technological chicken influencing both the architectural and the musical egg, because it meant that singers no longer needed to project to the back of a 2,000 seat auditorium. It meant that they could project in a style that could allow them to sing quietly and intimately. Crooning was what they called it. The microphone allowed that, and it also allowed clubs to become a very important place for music because it allowed singers and big bands to have a lot of parity. In the medium-sized clubs and even the small clubs, but those that were big enough for a big band, you could have a singer with the microphone and no one else would be amplified. And even today in small clubs that have that kind of music, you can kind of see that. So hence you see the technology influencing both of those things. Now, as clubs for music became a thing in this world of commercialized music, we see a lot of genres spring up that wouldn't necessarily have been possible without the modern conception of the music club. I'm thinking specifically of jazz and combo jazz, meaning jazz that doesn't involve a big band, but maybe a trio, a quartet, a sextet at the most. So between 3 and 6 people, let's say, in a club. And this is an example of architecture and music really having a wonderful relationship. A small club necessarily means that a big band, let alone a huge orchestra, isn't going to be practicable. So you're going to have a small group of musicians. Now, how does that small group of musicians captured the attention of audiences that had been familiar with the large big bands of the vaudeville era, the music hall, the big band ballroom? How is this going to work? Well, what was needed was a genre of music where intricacy was where the excitement was derived from, rather than the overall dynamics. Thus, you see genres like bebop, hard bop, avant-garde jazz, any kind of jazz that relies on, let's say, the classic quartet or quintet or sextet, small group of musicians playing intricate music, and the club served as the perfect place to house that music. Because when you're in an intimate setting, you don't need to rely on amplification or incredibly good acoustics to hear every last detail of the saxophonist solo, what the bass player was doing on his unamplified contrabasso, his string bass, the intricacies of a drummer like Art Blakey or Max Roach going both quiet and loud because the dynamics weren't predicated on filling a huge space. So you could let loose a bit more as a drummer and not have to keep everything steady in terms of dynamics. So jazz was very much something that benefited from the boom in the club scene in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s. So let's talk next about rock and roll, which was a genre that again had a very interesting relationship with architecture. So rock and roll began to take over from what we call classic pop as the primary sonic idiom which defined the most popular of all pop music genres. If classic pop is defined by the Bing Crosbys, the Dean Martins, the Frank Sinatras, then rock was what overtook them at some point in the 60s, around the mid 60s, really, but it was kind of complete by the late 60s, even though those other guys were still selling records. We cannot forget that. But by the end of the 60s, rock and roll was sort of the musical language that was most domineering in the pop music sphere. And it's quite ironic that in rock and roll's early days, people were flummoxed about how to get it to fill large venues. There's the very famous case of the Beatles playing at Shea Stadium, where the New York Mets played in New York in 1964, and no one could hear them because they were using club sized amplification, just about. And so, of course, that's not going to work in a huge outdoor stadium. It frustrated them so that it led them to say, this touring isn't going to work. Clubs are too small to hold all of our fans, but stadiums are too large for people to hear our music. So they retreated to the studio. But the PA system, as we know it, was something that had arrived by the end of the 60s. And the reason for it is that necessity being the mother of invention, and invention being something that is very incentivized by having commercial music in the commercial rather than the private space, the government space, or the sacred space, there was an incentive for those who made loudspeakers and amplifiers to create musically large public address systems that were designed for music, specifically for music. And when we're talking about those large PA systems, they were really thinking rock and roll, because it had become apparent that while even with a large PA system, jazz doesn't work in arenas and stadiums. It's too intricate, and the intricacies of the music will be lost because of the acoustic realities of a basketball arena or a football stadium. Same too with a singer-songwriter or a crooner. You can do it, you can manage it if you have to, but the intricacies of the lyrics in a genre that is all about one star vocalist. Think Frank Sinatra again. In a huge football stadium, the intimacy gets lost. What good is hearing a singer if you can't even hear the articulations that he's making with his mouth, let alone the lyrical vocalizations? Rock and roll did not have these problems per se. And the reasons for this are because it was necessarily a dynamically loud genre that relied heavily on amplified instruments, electric guitar, a drum set that could be played very loud because it wasn't having to compete with an acoustic string bass. It was competing with a Marshall stack where an electric guitar was plugged in. Electric bass, of course, modern electric keyboards that were all, of course, amped up. And so rock and roll was a genre that was tailor made for filling these big venues. The sound was already loud. It already had elements of distortion. There was a lot of sort of singing where you'd have two or three members of the band sing the chorus. So the idea that you were so fixated on one man or one woman with the microphone wasn't as important. So long as you could hear the strumming of the guitars, the drummer in the back, the keyboard player, and all that stuff, you were at a rock and roll show. The individuality of the lyrics, while important, it didn't have that essentialism that it would have had if you were listening to Frank Sinatra sing, or Dean Martin, or Ella Fitzgerald. And so by the time you get to the late 60s, people who were promoting concerts worked with people who designed sound systems, like the Clare brothers, for instance, and they would take large stacks of Altec Lansing and JBL speakers, put them on scaffolding in front of the stage, and this was true whether you're at an indoor or outdoor venue. Daisy chain them to multiple amplifiers. The more powerful, the better, and just let it rip. And lo and behold, it worked, because you have a genre now that is tailor made to be played loud, and where generally intricacy isn't as important as it is in jazz, and where vocal detail isn't as important as it was in classic pop or vocal jazz. Other things to consider as well is the rhythm. Jazz, especially the kinds of jazz that were developing in the 60s and 70s, could be very rhythmically intricate. You had odd meters, you had tempo changes, you had some very fast tempi. And that doesn't really work because of the acoustical properties in a huge stadium or basketball arena or large outdoor field. Rock and roll tends to have more of a moderate and steady tempo. Again, tailor made for the large. Now, it just so happened that in North America in the 60s and 70s, a new generation of football stadiums was being built. Many of them were stadiums that were home to both baseball and football teams. They were generally very concrete, somewhat brutalistic, and they were everywhere. And when there wasn't a football or baseball game on, you had to have something in there. So rock and roll filled that void. And this was in an era when there were a lot of different genres that were all very popular. We're in the 70s now. And like I was saying on a video the other day, the 70s was probably the most diverse time for music. You had the Philadelphia soul sound, you had psychedelic funk, you had danceable funk, jazz funk fusion, classic funk, soul music, the modern soul music of the 70s, singer songwriter music. You had still a lot of great vocalists that came out. You had country and western music, so many different varieties of rock and roll, blues based rock, hard rock, early heavy metal, progressive rock. But one thing that, from a commercial and architectural point of view, all of these genres of rock had in common is that they were ready made for the stadium. You plug them into the amplifiers, hook that up to the PA, turn it up to 11, and let it rip. And so, while lots of genres of music were very popular, think disco, another 70s music genre, that was music that was designed for the club. And rock and roll was something that you could fill a stadium with. So it's no coincidence that of all of these musical genres, the one that was the most commercially viable in the 70s was rock, because not only could it sell a lot of albums, but it could fill the largest venues and do so without tremendously sacrificing the sonic experience the way that you would have to do if you were to fill these huge venues with other styles of music. Now, this continued on into the 80s, where rock remained the most ubiquitous and most profitable genre. In the 90s, it was still big. Rock was big business, but hip hop was climbing up the record charts in the 90s. And by the 2000s, hip hop derived pop music had begun to supplant rock and roll derived pop music. Now, this presented a problem for live music venues, because while rock and roll music was accidentally tailor made for the larger than life venue, rap music was, much like jazz, very specifically a club music. Before it was in the clubs, it was a street music, something where if you're a bunch of kids gathered on the street, it's even more intimate in many ways than a club. Um, and this was music that was much like the classic pop of Frank Sinatra. It was, now we're back to a heavy reliance on lyrical articulation. You could be in the 500th row at Three Rivers Stadium listening to David Lee Roth along with Michael Anthony and Eddie Van Halen go Panama, and you can hear it and you can sing it back out there. But when you want to listen to Frank Sinatra croon at you, or when you want to listen to Ice T or Ice Cube or Easy E or Snoop Dogg rap at you, you really want to hear the lyrics. The other problem that hip hop presented, which made it almost even less venue friendly than jazz, is there was less visually going on. In jazz, you have saxophones, a rather large instrument, you have a drum set, a string bass, a very prominent instrument, where with hip hop, you have one or at most a small group of people with a microphone and a DJ, which visually isn't much to look at unless you're standing behind him. From 500, 100 yards back, it just looks like a guy in the distance in front of a couple of turntables. So hip hop, while dominating the charts by the end of the 90s, it was having a hard time filling the big venues convincingly. Now the answer eventually came in the form of theatricality. If again, rock and roll was successful in these huge venues with or without theatricality. Bands like Pink Floyd pushed the theatricality to its limits, but if you were listening to Led Zeppelin or Bad Company or Van Halen or Robin Trower, these guys didn't have elaborate stage sets, certainly not at the beginning. They had the lights, a few smoke machines, and the rest was about 4 or 5 guys on stage just doing it. With hip hop, though, again, because of the less physical element, just microphones and a DJ, you needed that extra visual element if you were going to take this suddenly extremely popular genre into the big venues that the record labels and the promoters expected to fill because of their great 30-year run with rock bands. And so you have the Up in Smoke tour at the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, and you start to see theatrical elements, lowriders going across the stage, huge jumbotrons, really advanced light shows. And the man who I think really assured hip hop's survival in the stadium and in the arena was Ye, then known as Kanye West, because Kanye West, as someone who was from outside of the world of gangster rap or reality rap, he was probably more comfortable with taking that genre from the streets to the street of Broadway, if you will. And he brought that kind of Broadway, Pink Floyd, Michael Jackson style theatricality to the hip hop arena, literally the arena or the football stadium, by saying, look, we accept that this is music that is designed for intimate experiences, the club. But we're going to make it so visually astounding that you're going to forget that fact and just embrace this Broadway style, larger than life theatrical display. And that is exactly what he did. And of course, he owed a lot to Michael Jackson, who took pop style vocals that were not in the rock and roll realm and using theatricality brought that to the stadium in a way that few other vocal solo artists were able to do before. Michael Jackson, though, of course, was helped that his music itself was highly cinematic in nature and that it lent itself to that experience. So, where are we now today in 2024 going on? I'm 2024 going on 2025. Like and subscribe right now. Right now, we're at an era where the idioms of the pop world are still very much influenced by hip hop derived sounds, synth patches, electronic processed drums, things like that. And it is the theatricality. When you look at a Taylor Swift show, the reason it works at these stadiums is that it's an event. Lights, video monitors of all sizes, risers going up and down, backing dancers, sometimes 100 strong. We can now, because jumbotrons, I know that's a copyrighted term by Sony, but large video monitors, because they're so much better and comparatively adjusted for inflation cheaper than they were in the 1980s and 90s, you can do much more with them. Every little detail of a Taylor Swift costume change is in 4K on the big screen at SoFi Stadium. And so again, it's music that didn't really initially lend itself to the arena and the stadium, that thanks to technology has made it work in that unique architectural environment. Looking back at it, I would say that the genres that have the best relationship with architecture are the romantic orchestral European classical music of the 19th century and rock and roll, because both of these genres were tailor made for large venues compared to that which came before it. The orchestras of Wagner and his successors assured future generations that the model of classical concert hall music was going to be a large orchestra in a large, beautiful concert hall. Likewise, rock and roll's success as a very poignantly loud style of music assured that the genre would never go back to the club. Obviously, when you're starting out, you start in the rock club, but in terms of the successful rock band, it would never be the kind of music that would go back to the club. It was always going to be the music whose success was going to be measured in which arena and which stadium you're going to play in. And the other thing that this influences is the mobility of such music, and likewise the concept of residency. Let's say you're a really popular jazz musician like Herbie Hancock. Now, yes, you can sell out a 5,000 seat theater, but people will pay top dollar for a 3 week residency of Herbie Hancock at a major jazz club in the markets where that would be appropriate. Think New York, LA, Chicago, London, Paris, those sorts of markets, because people would rather see Herbie Hancock in a small club paying top dollar than they would at a large venue. Solution: multiple nights in a row rather than one night. Inversely, the rock band doing a stadium tour doesn't need to be on the road for as long, because if you can kill 60,000 birds, meaning 60,000 tickets sold in one night, rather than having to go to theaters or even arenas, it means that maybe you'll have 12 dates on a nationwide tour, or 15, rather than the 25 that you would need in arenas, or the 50 that you would need in theaters, let alone the club situation, where you might need weeks at a time if you're a big enough artist in a club style genre. Or alternatively, if it's one night only in a club, and let's say you're having a launch party for a hip hop album, those tickets are going to be 2 grand a piece to, let's say, hear a really prominent hip hop artist like Ye premiere something at a club. So architecture and music aren't as separate as people think. In fact, I would say that their influence on one another is incredibly symbiotic, has been so through the years, and probably will continue to be, because human beings will always want to play music of one genre or another, and we will always need a place in which to do it. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think in the comments. And as always, like and subscribe. We now offer memberships and super chats on this channel that help things to stay afloat. So that is much appreciated. We will see you next time. Take care.